works for the Department of Ag. He's the local inspector for things like the DAR, which we're here to talk about tonight. And so I'm just going to turn it over to her.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone who was able to make it tonight. So yes, I'm a regional veterinarian for the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Animal Health, which we regulate a variety of different things having to do with domestic animals. We don't deal with wildlife for the most part, except when they're rabid, then we deal with them. Otherwise, it's domestic animals, and we regulate mostly what's under the domestic animal law, which includes all kinds of things from the rabies regulations to licensing pet stores and bird diseases and things like dead animal disposal. My background a little bit is I'm from Chester County. I've been here since I was 1, and I live about 15 minutes away from here. I went to Penn State for my animal science degree. Then I went to the University of Pennsylvania for vet school, and when I graduated, I was in practice as a large animal vet here. I was actually based out of Honey Brook, covering Chester County, parts of Lancaster and Berks County, seeing all kinds of livestock. So I'm very, very familiar with this township, this whole area, and I've been covering it for the Department of Agriculture for 7.5 years now for all kinds of different things that go on in an agricultural community. Here today to talk about dead animal disposal, obviously. And kind of, you get right into it with the title of a talk called Dead Animal Disposal. You know, it sort of is, brings us right to the idea of what I would call the yuck factor. I know, I didn't grow up on a farm, so I understand people who didn't grow up with farming or with agriculture or other things like that. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with death, dying, dead animals. They're not the most pleasant things to think about or talk about or see. But to me, that's the yuck factor. There's a lot more to it than just the yucky idea of it, sort of the emotional aspect of death and dead animals. The yuck factor means that while it's something unpleasant, it's not necessarily harmful or dangerous or illegal. It's just kind of yucky to some people. So I do understand that and recognize it, and certainly we're going to be talking about dead animals and dead animal disposal, so hopefully there won't be too much of that yuck factor in my actual presentation. My goal is to go through the regulations, a little bit of explanation about how it is that we've come to be where we are now. Why are things different now than they were, say, 30 years ago, or even 5 years ago, as far as dead animal disposal goes. And then to explain a little bit about composting itself, what it is and what it isn't, how it works, the things that it's able to do, and I have all kinds of delightful pictures to share. I guess the only other thing would be I'd ask that, I have kind of a big favor, I guess. I'd ask that anyone who has any preconceived notions about disposal of dead animals try to have an open mind and just listen to what I have to say. On the way out the door, you can pick up whatever preconceived notions you had and take them home with you if you still want them. But maybe there'll be something that I say that's a little bit different or something that you didn't expect to hear. I don't expect everyone to leave and start their own compost pile, but if you want to, you can contact me and I can give you more detailed information later. So what are the legal options for disposal of dead animals in Pennsylvania? And again, this is domestic animals. Burial, incineration, rendering, or composting within 48 hours of death. Where this comes from is the domestic animal law. And you can find the domestic animal on the computer, I can get you a copy. There's a little portion I call the dead animal disposal part. It's just a section of the domestic animal law. And it lays it out. If you have dead animals, they have to be either buried in accordance with regulations governing water quality. Department of Agriculture doesn't regulate water quality in Pennsylvania. Water quality is regulated by the Department of Environmental Protection for the most part. So they would be the organization that could say, yes, this is an okay place to bury, or no, this is not. It's tricky in Pennsylvania. I don't know if you've ever tried to bury anything. In my backyard, if you try to bury something and you get about this deep and you hit giant boulders. So it's pretty hard to bury even a cat in my backyard, let alone, say, a cow. A cow requires roughly a 10-foot deep hole. You either need some pretty heavy equipment or a lot of laborers and shovels, because it's a big project to dig a hole adequate for a cow. The other issue we have is, in some areas you may have a high water table in Pennsylvania, or you may be too close to a flooding creek. Sort of little known fact about Pennsylvania, although you may be aware of it here, Pennsylvania is #1 in the nation for flooding, which, we tend to think of places like Florida, because they have more dramatic ocean-type flooding, but we have all the little aggravating river flooding here in Pennsylvania. So there are a lot of areas that may, for parts of the year, be underwater. So that's not a good place to bury, because if you bury something and it ends up underwater, it tends to return to us. So we don't want that. So burial can be a tricky thing to do properly. Also, we have this issue called winter in Pennsylvania. We didn't have it this year, but we usually have winter, and the ground's frozen. So for several months of the year, you would not be able to dig a hole. The alternative would be to have prepped ahead of time and have a big hole ready in case you have an animal die during the winter. But that's kind of dangerous to have a giant hole hanging out in the backyard. So that's not a great way to deal with it either. Another legal option is incineration. But incineration has to be in accordance with regulations governing air quality. Again, those would be regulations that are under the Department of Environmental Protection. Incineration is tricky as well. So there are sort of two main ways of doing that. You either have open burning, that you're going to have pretty major problems with. Cows, horses, people for that matter, we're mostly water. So it's pretty hard to burn water. Therefore, you have to use a lot of flammable stuff to keep a fire going enough to burn up an entire cow or horse, let alone more than one of them. In England, when they had foot and mouth disease, they would burn these giant piles of cattle, and it would take hundreds, if not thousands, of gallons of diesel fuel, piles and piles of tires, and railroad ties. You can imagine burning those things kind of creates rather a lot of pollution. Really a major problem. It was an environmental disaster, but also a human health problem, because they had anyone who had any kind of respiratory problem anywhere near that was in real trouble. So that open burning is really not a viable option here. The other option is a closed incinerator, like a cremation service would have. That works pretty well. You still need a lot of input, a lot of fuel and energy to make that work, but they have a lot of filters on those systems to keep the pollution from getting out. Problem is, there aren't that many of them, and they're very, very costly to operate and maintain and put the fuel inputs in. So it's really not practical for the most part. We have a few in Pennsylvania that can handle livestock-sized animals, but it takes a while and it costs a fortune. I've had a few clients who have cremated horses, and it costs more than $1,000 a horse to do that. So it's definitely not a practical option for your everyday disposal. So we're left with processing by rendering, fermenting, composting, or other method that could be established. Right now, there aren't a lot of other methods out there. I did skip, though, what is somewhat of a popular method at sometimes, which is dragging the animal out and leaving it to lay somewhere out in the field somewhere. So that is a natural way of getting rid of them, I suppose, is that, yes, we leave it out there and it rots or is eaten by wildlife. But it's not really a good way. We don't really like that. One thing is the potential for the spread of infectious disease. And I have to pause here to make it clear that the vast majority of cattle and horses, and I'm sticking with those species because that's what we have the most of around here, the vast majority of them that die do not die from infectious disease. Dairy cattle, most commonly, they're dying from problems related to calving or sort of the aftermath of that. When they start milking a lot, they can have a lot of health problems from that are an individual cow problem, not an infectious disease. They also can get injured. Certainly whenever we have an icy spell in the winter, we have cows that are slipping and breaking their legs or popping a hip out of its socket. So there are a lot of problems like that. This summer we had the opposite end of things. We had the ridiculously hot, never-ending heat summer. And that's really rough on cows especially. Milking cows are hot already. Now they're really, really hot, and they tend to end up with some more problems. horses, if you have working horses, pulling, driving, you end up with more dead horses when it's hot as well. So most of the time it's not an infectious disease killing them, but if they have an infectious disease, we don't particularly want them laying around in the field somewhere where other animals could come across them. Another thing people don't often think about is the possible poisoning of wildlife. And some people might think that's a good thing. Hey, we've been having a lot of coyotes around here, and that's one way to get rid of them, I suppose. But the problem is you can't just aim that carcass at a coyote. Other things are out there. And when we're talking about poison in this sense, it's not things like rat poison. What it's mainly would be if you had an animal that was put down by the vet, the euthanasia solution that we use to put them to sleep is in there. And if say your neighbor's dog comes along and gnaws on that, or your dog, then they could become euthanized themselves. And that's not a good situation to be in. But even worse than that is when you have an endangered species situation. And there have been a few of these where a bald eagle decides to come down and gnaw on your euthanized carcass that you have left lying in your field, and they die, and now you have the federal authorities coming after you. So kind of weird situations, good reasons not to leave it lay. You don't want to attract scavengers to your property particularly either. We have a lot of rabies in our area, so the last thing we don't want to do is attract any more mammals to our property if we can possibly avoid it. There can be soil, water, and air contamination. I'm not sure exactly why it is, but we tend to find a lot of times when people drag a cow and leave it lay, it's by a creek. I don't know why. I don't know if it's just that the creek tends to be out back and it's far enough away, but we find that can be a problem. And it's a waste of valuable resources. This is another thing people don't tend to think about. A cow or a horse is a valuable animal. There's a big cost to having that animal, putting the money in to feed them, raise them, and then there's the value that they provide through the service that they provide, whether they're milking, whether they will be raised for meat, or if they're used for driving, pleasure riding, whatever. When they die, you lose all of that, but it doesn't have to be a complete, well, she's dead, that's the end of that. That dead cow, for example, is still very high in nutritional value. We're not going to eat her because she didn't make it to a slaughter plant, so she wasn't processed appropriately for human consumption. But we can harvest those nutrients in other ways. They're very rich in nitrogen or proteins, as well as minerals. So if we have ways that we can reuse those, at least it's not completely going to waste. It's the way we all talk now about environmentally conscious things like recycling our cans and plastic and paper. We can recycle our dead animals at least, so that they are not just trash. We do get the calls. Since we cover the dead domestic animal law, we are the people who are called when someone is complaining that there is a dead animal that's been left to lay in the field. So I get to investigate those cases. Usually it's somebody's neighbor or brother or whoever it is who says, they left this dead animal lying in the field, and we go out to investigate. Because sometimes, especially in the area that I cover down here in southeastern Pennsylvania, we have a lot of people who are not familiar with agriculture or agricultural animals, and they may be very well-meaning, but we've had a number of calls where they say there's a dead horse in the field, and the dead horse was in fact just sleeping. Horses do lie down to sleep, which is, there's some sort of general myth out there that horses sleep standing up all the time. So we do check to make sure it's dead first, then we will investigate, and we talk to the people who would be responsible, whoever is responsible for that property and that animal. Our role, even though we are a regulatory agency, is to try to educate the people, because the vast majority of the time when I go out on a dead animal complaint, it is not something that was done maliciously. It is done through ignorance, through a lack of understanding of appropriate means of disposal, whatever the situation. So our first effort is to talk to them, provide them with the information they need to dispose properly. But then we do follow up. I wasn't born yesterday. We know we have to follow up and make sure that it does happen. And if we do continue to have problems, we do have regulatory action that we can take, such as writing criminal citations or civil penalties. It's rarely necessary, happily. This is one that is a little hard to tell what it is, but this was someone who was getting rid of dead chickens by throwing them in a pit. It was an elaborate pit, it was concrete, but it was just an open pit essentially. So that is not in fact an approved method of disposal, and they had to stop doing that. But that had been, I think, some traditional way of disposing of them whenever, and now, they just needed to be educated on it's a better thing to do would be to compost these chickens.
They were just rotting down in there?
Why, yes.
Is that it?
Yes.
It's ugly.
It's the not so pleasant chicken soup recipe. So if we're talking about recycling cows, well, why not just render them? So rendering is more or less the process of cooking down the animal to make byproducts such as tallow, other fats, oils, waxes that go into use in other industries such as cosmetics, gelatin, things like that. And that certainly is a good way of reusing that animal. That is traditionally what was done. Certainly the vast majority of cattle in Pennsylvania were disposed of through rendering for many, many years. Probably in most parts of the country that was the norm. You would have the knacker man come and pick up your cows and take them off. For many years they would actually pay the farmer to take the dead animals because then they would use it to make a usable product. For many reasons, the business model of rendering didn't go so well, and there were more rendering companies making more product than the industry could use, and the economy in this country wasn't going so well, so there were fewer businesses able to take the product. So several years ago, the business started declining. In many parts of the country, rendering shut down completely. We still did have it here, but no longer were they paying the farmer for their cows. And that was still okay, but then it became that they were charging the farmer to take away their cows, and the fee was going up and up and up. So it was becoming less of a viable option for farmers. Farmers do not make much money, and in our area, certainly there are certain crops that make a lot more money, but depending on what you do, if you're a small dairy farmer, it's not a very lucrative business. And we're talking over $100 to get rid of a single cow in many cases. So that was a problem. Because that started happening in many parts of the country and here, agricultural agencies, farm agencies, extension services started looking into alternatives and talking more to farmers about options like composting. Composting has been the normal way of disposal for poultry for a while now, and for swine as well. So it's a very established thing that's been going on in those sectors. It just hadn't quite moved to this area because rendering was an option. The final nail was put in the coffin of rendering, for us at least, with a federal regulation change in April of 2009, and this was a pretty big deal. It's because of BSE, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which is much easier to say as mad cow disease. Mad cow disease was not a problem here. Mad cow disease was a problem in England, and some parts of Europe, but mainly England. Started about 15 years ago. They were having a whole bunch of cows with this strange brain problem, and then they were having a few people that had it as well. They finally put together that the basic problem there was that they were feeding cows to cows. So this part is back to the yuck factor again, I'm afraid. You'd have a dead cow there that might have this brain abnormality. They would grind them up and feed that cow brain back to cows. So it was recycling that bad brain disease in the cattle population, and it increased it to a pretty high level there in their cattle because of that feeding practice. At that time, laws were in this country to keep that from happening. So even though we didn't actually have the problem here, we certainly didn't want it either. So the laws were that you can't feed any cows to cows in this country, and a whole bunch of regulations were put in place to try to prevent that from happening. Seemed to be going well, but in April 2009, the federal government decided that rendering was a possible risk, that perhaps this fat or whatever could accidentally be fed, even though it was against the law, back to cattle. And so they put in a whole bunch more rules that renderers would have to be able to do all of these different things to be able to continue to take adult cattle. And the renderers basically said, yeah, we don't really want to do that. So here they said we're not taking adult cattle anymore. And in this area they stopped about February of 2009 in preparation for this passing. So I think probably most people would still be sending their cows to rendering, except it's not an option. They had no choice. It was taken away completely. So around that time, well, we went basically from a system that had been for decades, that's what the normal way to get rid of your cows was rendering, and then we had nothing to do with the cows, all of a sudden. And there were few options. Basically, we had your burial, which was for many reasons a problem. We have landfills, which is something that comes up periodically. And there are some people who do haul to landfills. Problems with landfills are, well, they're private companies, so they have every right to say, we don't want to take dead animals, and many of them do. They will refuse to take them, depending. Sometimes it seems to depend on the day. We're not sure how it works in some of the landfills. Others will accept them, but we are in a society where we have a lot of trash and not a lot of places to put it. So landfill real estate is very valuable. I don't know if you've noticed, at least in my township, our trash bill has been going up and up and up every year. And the reason for that is the tipping fees at the landfills go up dramatically every year because the real estate available in the landfill goes down. It costs a lot of money to dump a cow in a landfill. You're wasting all the nutrients because in a landfill, they're just packed down, and we hope they stay down because things in the landfill have a way of shifting and things can pop up where you least expect them sometimes. But they just sit there and they sort of rot and mummify in there. They don't actually degrade all the way in a landfill. So, not a great option either. So what did we find? Well, exactly what you'd expect. Around April of 2009, we started getting more complaints about people having dead cows lying around. Not very surprising, we knew it was coming. We had done some work with farmers to talk to them about doing composting at their farms, but I don't know if everyone really believed that rendering was seriously going to go away. So a lot of people were not prepared. We had cows all over the place, and I have heard from more than one person that there were a lot of dead cows lying right out here in Honey Brook Township at this time. That is not because the farmers were evil people or were malicious or wanted to do harm to anyone, for the most part. There may have been some, I don't know. But most of the time, the issue is if people don't have a viable option or any options for how to deal with a situation, they do nothing. And that's what was happening. Cows were just laying. So we were dealing with it kind of on a one-on-one basis. And then we started having a few entities around the state start talking about a new business of taking the animals like the renderers did, but composting them. Or I think there's one area way out in central Pennsylvania where they're using a biodigester system, like the methane digestion they use to create energy from cow poop. But most places they were talking about composting. So that brings us to the licensure requirement for this. We had a license for a while since we had the domestic animal law for dead domestic animal disposal businesses. Not a license you hear about every day. There aren't that many of them in the common law. For years and years, the only people who had these licenses were rendering companies, a few landfills, and cremation services. But now we have a few people who applied for it for composting. This definition explains what makes you a dead domestic animal disposal business. If you are a farmer disposing of your own cow on your property, you don't need a license. You just do what you need to do. If you're taking somebody else's cow and disposing of it, then you need your license. The conditions of licensure for this license are pretty simple. There are inspections. You have to inspect before they're licensed. And because, like I mentioned, we don't regulate water quality. I don't know a whole lot about water quality. I don't pretend to. We have DEP go out with us. Even though we, Department of Agriculture, issues the license, we have DEP come out so they can evaluate that whole issue. They can look at water, whatever it is that they do with that. We also usually have the Conservation District come out with us. They're the people they're not a regulatory agency, but they deal with nutrient management plans, soil issues, and some watershed issues. So we usually have them come out as well to give their thoughts on the project. They do have to dispose of them by those methods we have stated are approved. And then we can set requirements for how they have to manage things, keeping in mind our goal. Our regulatory goal is to prevent the transmission of disease, mostly between domestic animals, but potentially to people who are animals as well. So that's what we focus on, is how to prevent the transmission of disease. Parts of that would include how we handle the product, and things like biosecurity standards. I sort of hate the word biosecurity because it sounds scary, and it's really not. I think it's because it sounds a lot like biohazard, and it's not at all the same thing. Biosecurity really means preventing germs from moving from one place to another place. That's all. So you may see, if you're around here, a lot of farms nowadays have signs up that say biosecurity zone, no trespassing, or agricultural security zone, no trespassing. And that doesn't mean that there's anything bad going on there, or that there's a particular disease outbreak. It doesn't mean that they're hiding anything. It's actually considered a best management practices for farms nowadays to have it posted, so that we don't have random people wandering across. I've seen, I don't know how many times, we get in this part of Chester County and certainly Lancaster County, tourists who come from who knows where and will park their car and just walk up someone's lane and start taking pictures of their clothes on the line or whatever. It's disturbing, yes. I don't know, I don't go look at other people on my vacations personally, but that's what we have, is these wanderers. We've had people wander right into barns with the cows, and we don't want that. We don't know where else they might be wandering and carrying germs around. We don't know what they might do. To some extent, it's to protect them as well, because probably people who happen to wander onto a farm don't particularly know how to deal with, say, the bull that's in the field or the large cranky mule. So that's all biosecurity means. If you see those signs, it's nothing alarming. If they have a big disease outbreak, I will post a quarantine sign, which is very different. It's fluorescent yellow, so you'll see that as a separate issue. Okay, we're finally to composting. So that was all the background information. What is composting? Does anyone here compost anything? Most people are familiar with it from gardening, at least. I compost vegetable scraps and paper towels and whatever else I can put in the compost pile. Composting is just the process of turning something that is an undesirable raw material, such as a dead cow, into a useful and beneficial product. In this case, what we would call a soil amendment, which means basically compost is nutritionally rich dirt that you're creating out of what you had before was kind of a stinky dead cow that you didn't want around, and now you have a helpful soil that you can use to improve the soil in a field. Usually this is used to replenish soil that has been used to grow something, so whatever the crop is has taken nutrients out of the soil, and this can put it back in. Composting works by speeding up natural decomposition, which is performed by microorganisms, which are tiny little invisible microscopic creatures, mostly bacteria, fungi, and actinomycetes, which are something in between bacteria and fungi. And they do the heavy lifting. These tiny little creatures, these microorganisms, work really hard to digest all of the bits of the dead whatever it is and the plant material and turn them back into soil. Little diagram of composting, you have your pile, oxygen goes into the pile from the air, makes those little microorganisms happy, they're doing their job, they're creating heat and breaking down what you've put in the pile, water vapor and carbon dioxide come out of the pile, and you end up eventually with the stabilized organic residue or compost. This is our cow recycling diagram. Factors that affect the composting process are basically a variety of things. I won't go into super deep detail on any of them for now, but the idea is we want those little bugs to be happy, because happy workers do their job and they do it quickly and well. The most basic part of it is you have to have plant material and animal material in the pile. The plant material has more carbon, the animal material has more nitrogen. If you get the right mixture of those two things in the pile, you have a good composting process going on. If you have too much dead animal and not enough plants in there, you can have more odor problems. You can also have more liquid coming out. If you have too much plant material and not enough animal, then it takes a longer time. It doesn't go as quickly. Most of these little organisms need air, they need oxygen, so you have to be careful not to drown them. You have to use material to cover it that is not too small particles. So if you put mud on top of a compost pile, no air is going to be able to get in there. So the microorganisms are going to die. If you put big chunks of tree branches on top, too much air is going to get in there and it's going to be completely dry and cold and it won't work either. So you want the right mixture so that a good amount of oxygen can get in there without blowing stuff away. Moisture content's important too. You want them to be nice and moist but not drowning. We do the squeeze test, and we really do. And the really hardcore compost people do it with bare hands. I usually wear a glove. But you grab a hunk of compost, you squeeze it. If water runs out, it's too wet. If you squeeze it and you open your hand and it blows away, it's too dry. What you want is to squeeze it, open your hand, and have a ball of compost sitting there. That's the right amount of moisture. How you control this is a bit of a challenge. If you live somewhere like Pennsylvania, where we seem to alternate between drought and monsoons. Drought's a little easier to deal with if you have any sort of water supply. You can water it to add in the moisture you need. When we have our monsoon type situations, it's a little trickier because unless you have a roof over it, which most people don't, you can't really keep the water out too well. So you just have to deal with wet compost, which will take longer and potentially has more odors. Temperature is really important for a few reasons. Composting occurs best between 50 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's when the bugs are happiest. When you get over 140 degrees, some of the bugs start dying off. The pile will cool down again then, and you'll have other microorganisms take over the composting process. Usually when you start a compost pile, within a day or two, you get a temperature spike, so it gets really hot. And that will stay that way for several days until enough of the microorganisms have died off to let it cool down a bit. What's really important about that is that most of the pathogens, or the microorganisms that can cause disease, so not our good little helper microorganisms, but the ones we don't want around, most of those are killed at 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you get this temperature spike up to 160 degrees, they're toast, which is great. And this is the reason why regulatory agencies tend to prefer using composting when we're dealing with disposal. So the most common situation would be bird flu. When you're dealing with bird flu, if you have a bunch of dead chickens from bird flu, we don't want it getting trapped all over the place. If we say put all those chickens on a truck and drive them to a landfill, we could be tracking it behind us. So we compost them on site, heats up, and it kills that bird flu right away. It's great. We do testing to follow up to make sure. So it's a great way of killing stuff we don't want to be there.
Does that mean that once it's going through this composting process, the material that you get out of it is, I don't know what the right technical term is, but I'll say sanitary, that there's nothing.
Right, it's not sterile because it's outside, but it is not, all those harmful things that could have been in there have been killed, which is really nice. So unlike if you have a nice rot pit of chickens where nothing ever dies, if you compost it, it kills off those nasty bugs. There are a few that are not killed by it, but again, they're not problems that we have here, so that's convenient. Anthrax would be one. Anthrax bacteria forms spores that can live through like nuclear winter. So we can't do much about that, but we also don't really have a major anthrax problem here, happily. The other one would be something like mad cow disease, which really is almost indestructible. So it wouldn't be killed by any of the other methods we have either. And again, we don't have that here anyway. What you use for composting, what we say most of the time is the best materials to use for composting are the materials that you have available. It doesn't do any good to try and find the perfect material for composting if you have to drive 3 hours away to get it. Most places have some combination of these things around if they have dead animals. All of these things can be good. You have to play around with it. There is some trial and error to figure out the best mixture for your particular situation. You want it to be nice and porous enough to let that air in, but not too porous and all of that. Different times of year may make a difference as well. Things like manure and finished compost may be either too wet in the case of manure or too fine particle size for either of those for most normal composting, but in the winter they can be helpful as an insulation layer on the outside. If it's really cold out, it helps to keep the inside of the pile hot so it keeps working even through the winter. Compost pile location is important too. Good drainage is really important. You don't want to build a compost pile down in a gully where it's going to be essentially in a swimming pool every time it rains because it won't work very well. You want it to be at least 200 feet from water sources, wells, lakes, whatever. Easy access for minimal travel, that's really important, and a lot of people don't think of that when they decide where they're going to put their compost pile. They forget that they're going to have to get there in all kinds of weather. If you put it somewhere that you can't get to in the winter, you'd be really lucky if you don't ever have a cow die in the winter, but you probably shouldn't count on that. So having it somewhere you can get to, and if you're going to be working with the piles, you want to be able to get equipment in there, and if you have more than one pile, you make sure you have room all the way around them. And away from public view. Why do we say that? Well, the yuck factor again. The yuck factor is that the people who don't want to think about or see or be aware of dead animals, it's very helpful if they don't have to see them. So we definitely hear more about people who put a compost pile right by the road, or the people who I do have to question their motives when we've had a few where they put the compost pile right next to the property line, right there, so their neighbor who has moved into a $500,000 house next to the farm can look out the window and see it. That's not an ideal situation. It's not illegal, but it doesn't make for good relations with the neighbors. So we prefer that they put it somewhere that is less visible. So if you're adding an animal to it, people don't see what's going on. Not because it's a secret, but because it's best not to upset the people who don't want to know about it. Oh, we're taking a break? Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't know we were taking a break. Wait, let me see where we're at. Okay, we'll just take a break here then. I have the next
Take a
person
break
to take
for 5
first.
minutes. I mean, you can take it.
All right, so you're going to be in trouble. What is a little tricky to see in this picture is right behind there, that low brown line. That's a creek. So this compost pile was built, I don't know, 15 feet maybe from the creek, which is not very good planning. So this compost pile needed to be moved. That was not a good location for it. Can anyone find something that's an issue with this compost pile location?
There's cows right next to it.
It's not a great idea to have your compost pile in with your live cattle for a few reasons. One is, you see the heavy equipment over there? Cows are not very good heavy equipment operators. I have actually in Honey Brook Township dealt with a cow that had eviscerated herself on a forklift, which is something you would think is kind of hard to do, but cows, big body, small brain. So you don't particularly want your livestock right near your heavy equipment that's moving around like that. And you really don't want your live animals climbing around on top of your compost pile. First of all, when you're adding a new animal in before it composts, if there are any germs in that cow, now these live cows are standing right on there. Also, you have these live cows that are mushing your whole nice pile up, which isn't so great. So ideally, you would like to have your livestock excluded from the area in which your dead animals will be. Does anyone see a problem with this compost location? It's a wee bit wet. They managed to find a spot that has a hill on 3 sides going down to the compost pile, so it's like a funnel right into there. You can see the compost sort of oozing in that direction. That's not a great plan either. Also, you see there's no access to this at all. You can see some sort of tire tracks going through the field, but you're certainly not going to be able to get there unless you're hauling cows on your snowmobile in the winter. So not very good planning as far as being able to continue to use that pile. Also, as far as it working very well, because it's going to be really soggy all the time. These piles are decent. They're windrows, we call them. They're long piles. The issue, as I see here, they are pretty wet. I'm not sure if in this situation this was just because it was right after rain, or if there's a chronic wetness problem there. There's a little bit of an issue because there are 2 windrows and they're only about 2 feet apart, which you would need a very, very small loader to get in between them. So it's going to be hard to manage those piles. Some people manage piles, which is where they turn them periodically. They turn it over to let more oxygen in there. It gets the microorganisms really pumped up again. It heats up the pile even more so that the composting process goes faster. Other people have what's called a static pile, where they just leave it lay. And that'll work too, but it'll take a lot longer.
Lisa, you said walk. What's the time frame for each of those?
There's a lot of variation based on the materials you're using, the wetness, all these other factors, but in general, we say for large animals like cows or horses, which we're talking 1,000 to 1,500 pounds most of the time, in 6 to 12 months would be the long side, so a static pile, they're gone, except for some of the largest bones. And if you're turning them, I've had some people get rid of them in, say, 3 months with a large animal. Small things like chickens, it's amazing. It's like a magic trick. You put chickens in a compost pile and you can go back in just a handful of weeks and there's nothing left. So it really is, if you can completely just not think about that it came from dead animals and avoid that, the yuck part of it, it's an amazing process. It's amazing that you can get rid of an entire cow by microscopic organisms eating it away and turning it into dirt that quickly. It seems like something that would happen over, eons, but it can be done really quickly. This pile, you can see it's in the winter, it has snow on it. It can still work. This is right at the edge of the woods. We see a number of piles like that just because it's kind of out of the way. It's not in land you want to plant. That's okay if you're not going to be managing the pile very much, so you don't need to get equipment around it very, very much or get back there too often. And apparently they don't because there are plants growing off this pile. With this site, what we see is a long lane, so that we like that because it's a distance back from the road. You can also see that it is a gravel road, so hopefully it's accessible in the winter. Another thing to note is the grass and planted area around the site. What that can help with is if you have runoff or excessive rain or whatever, it can be absorbed by what they call like a grassy buffer strip that helps to keep excessive runoff from coming down. Like if you had concrete all around, you'd have more runoff. Also trees, this is to remind me to mention trees we like around pretty much most agricultural type facilities, both for that sort of blocking the view of things aspect, but also because trees have been shown to be able to absorb some odors. So especially most of the research has been done with poultry houses, that they can be very helpful in that purpose as well. This is a pile again that has a nice little lane behind it. It's sort of out in the middle of nowhere, trees around, grass around. One thing with this slide you see there's a few bones in the front. I wanted to make sure you knew that bones are not a problem. They may be something people don't want to see, but they're not dangerous in any way. Once the bones have gone through the composting process, so all of the flesh has come off of them, they don't carry any disease. And they're actually really brittle. It's kind of weird. They break down very easily. So some people just put them back in the compost pile again, and most of them will go away. Other people get rid of them in another way through landfill or whatever. But a lot of people just spread it with the compost because they'll break down completely into dust when they go through just a normal manure spreader. It's not even like having a rock go through. You may actually be familiar with the product if you grow roses ever. The fertilizer they sell for roses in the garden store, you may have seen called bone meal. And that's what it is because it has a really good balance of calcium and phosphorus in it. And it's not just a name, it really is bone meal that they have in a bag for you. It adds a lot of calcium and phosphorus to the soil that you add it to, so it's actually a really helpful thing. So if you see bones, that's okay. It's not pretty, but it's not harmful. When you build a compost pile, you put out your base layer of material on the bottom. That's your shavings or your wood chips or whatever. We always go by about 2 feet in every direction. So we have 2 feet under, dead animals, 2 feet on top, and all the way around. If you have small enough animals, you can have layers. Chickens, you can have a lot of layers. Composting large animals, you need a little bit fewer layers because it's pretty hard to lift cows up really high. There is a big difference in dealing with a 3-pound chicken and a 1,500-pound Holstein. But hopefully you have a lot fewer dead Holsteins than you do dead chickens. So the composting process will take longer with large animals than with chickens, but it can be relatively quick. And people are constantly working on how to speed it up to get it even faster. So people are working with things like these rotocomposters, which are giant tubes. You put in stuff at one end and it rotates periodically to keep the oxygen going all the time. So it's constantly at the hotter end of the composting scale, and at the other end comes out compost, and it can be much faster than doing it in a pile. Lancing the rumen's a whole other issue. It's the largest part of the cow's stomach is called the rumen. When a cow is dead, they can't burp anymore, so they fill up with gas in that stomach, and they can explode. They don't explode like a bomb. It's not, dangerous to anybody, but it can be unpleasant. And if they're in the pile, it can blow off some of the cover of the pile so that part of the carcass is exposed. So some people poke a hole in the rumen before they put them in so that they can't explode. Most people don't anymore because it's not very pleasant if you poke a hole in the rumen. I have done it, and you have to grow new skin to get rid of the smell if you get it on you. Most people just put them in whole now and make sure they're covered. If they explode out the side, they just cover it again and it's fine. This is someone making a fresh pile. You have the base, cow, cover. I have quite an array of composting pictures. It's a bit disturbing. I was eating my lunch watching them yesterday and realized that perhaps that's not entirely normal. This shows up sort of 3 separate piles in the same location. This would be appropriate for somebody, say, who has only a handful of dead animals a year and not at the same time. So they start one pile, looks like that one in the back is the oldest. The piles will shrink down as the cow disappears. Then they start a new one, so they're not messing with that other pile, they're just keeping them all as static piles. These aren't the neatest piles in this picture, but everything's covered. This is a large windrow. Again, a windrow is just a long pile. Again, you can see bones like we talked about, but you don't have like a cow lying there. You have bones. And you can see it more or less looks like dirt. This just shows you a good shape of a compost pile. You have a peaked pile that will help if you don't have cover. So if it rains a lot, most of the rain will run down the side so it doesn't get as soggy in the middle. Pile next to a cornfield. This is windrows and a pile, and you can see some of the materials used for this pile, so you can see that one has more of a used bedding. A lot of people use bedding or refused feed, so the cows didn't eat something, they scrape it up with a scraper, they can put that on there, so it's great for recycling those products as well. These piles aren't very neat either, and you can see that it's pretty rutted there, it looks like it gets pretty wet. This is a different way of doing it. Some people put these large round bales or they use old silage bunkers. It's not ideal for composting because air doesn't get in there very well from the sides, but it's a little bit neater and easier to pick stuff up with your skid loader in the middle. More long windrows showing good spacing in between them. This one shows a large dairy facility. A lot of our large dairy facilities nowadays do have their own on-site composting. It's not open to the public. These are just for their own animals. These piles are downhill from the barn so that any runoff doesn't go into where the live animals are. This is a great picture to show how hot it gets. That's not dust, that's steam. So definitely, you never want to check your compost pile by sticking your arm into it because you will get burned. When we check the temperature, we use a long thermometer probe, but they can get really, really hot in there. It's pretty amazing. And that's what you want to see because that's what tells you germs are being killed here. More steaming compost. This is a rumen blowout hole. So cow exploded there, it blew off the cover from the pile. They just have to put a few more shovelfuls of cover on top of that. And this is showing him using the finished product. He's spreading it right through the manure spreader. Talked to a lot of people who use this kind of compost and really don't have any problem. A lot of people were pretty skeptical about it, had to be talked into trying it. They thought it was going to damage their equipment because of the bones and everything, and really haven't had any problems at all. It is part of people's nutrient management plans that they have with the conservation district, so they know that the nutrient components of it so they aren't over-fertilizing, but it makes a very good natural fertilizer. Advantages of composting are it's economical compared to our fuel alternatives. It's convenient because, especially for farmers who are just doing it at home, they don't have to go very far. Time of year is not an issue, which can be a big deal. Whenever you have a dead animal, you can put it in the pile. For the most part, they're low maintenance, but I always caution with that because you'll say low maintenance to some people and they say, good, I'm going to throw a cow out there and say, you go compost. It's not that low maintenance. You do have to put some effort into it, but it's pretty low maintenance compared to, say, digging a giant hole. And you come out with a usable product, which is something you don't get with any of the other methods we have available to us at this time. Disadvantage is you have to provide the feedstocks. That's just the fancy word for the plant material you're putting in with the dead animals. So you do have to have something to put in with them. Large animals, you may want to lance the rumen or do other preparation, and it is harder to move a cow than it is to move chickens. And it does take some time, space, and labor. That is the general presentation.